The following is an excerpt from the book Experiences of Thought by Anthony Kahn, available now on Amazon.com and Kindle. The Journey's End, Weighing the Soul. We now approach the end of our philosophical journey together, and it would seem appropriate at this point to reflect on the core ideas that we have encountered along the way. There are a number of key messages that this book seeks to impart. But let us start by recapping the central tenets of the model of reality that we have been developing throughout the last several chapters. In section 1.5, we outlined a set of criteria by which we might judge the merits of any particular model. And we propose that a model ought to exist out of need as opposed to want. That is to say, its inspiration must be a product of the intrinsic shortcomings of existing models and add something that alternative models cannot. We also highlighted the need of any model to satisfy Occam's razor and hence be the simplest in form that it possibly can be, while still fulfilling the same explanatory purpose. Lastly, we required that any model of value must be intellectually honest and open about its shortcomings. Let us then now examine our model against these criteria. The first criterion is the simplest and yet at the same time perhaps requires the most justification. Materialism is a very successful model and indeed the most obvious starting point for a philosophy of everything for a number of reasons. It is consistent with our impressions of the world that we begin to develop in our earliest days, and it comes along with its own test kit via the principles of empiricism. It is the realm of science and rich with utility, as the mathematics and mechanics that underpin it can be put to use in countless technologies. But as we have stated numerous times, there is a chink in its armor, and that chink comes by way of the hard problem of consciousness. Within conventional materialism, consciousness is an emergent feature, but consciousness is like no other thing in the entirety of the physical universe. It stands between us and any independent material universe that we might enact the tools of empiricism on. No matter what we do, and no matter how hard we try, there is no way we can step outside of this bubble. All information comes to us as part of the bubble, as experience and thought. As far as any of us is concerned, everything breaks down to become ultimately experience and thought. To presume that the material world exists in its own right as something altogether separate from consciousness is to add an extra cog in the model without any definitive requisite need. This, then, is the inspiration for our model, but not just our particular model. It is, in fact, the inspiration for the whole concept of idealism in general. People can presume that idealists doubt the existence of the real world, but this is certainly not a mandated feature of such philosophies. Here within this book and this model, there is no suggestion that the material world is in any way an illusion. That which we think of as the material or physical world, matter and energy, time and space are all very real. That much is not in question. Rather, what is being questioned is the ultimate nature of that which is physical, and particularly the idea that consciousness could be an emergent feature of the material world or anything less than fundamental. The funny thing about consciousness is that we all know that it is real from first-hand experience, and yet no experiment could ever verify its existence. Sure, we can point to associated aspects of it and say there is consciousness, but we can never prove that it exists in any scientific way. We could theoretically possess the technology to build a human body in the lab, atom by atom, without ever pinning down the source of consciousness, or even knowing if our creation actually was conscious. Just as a printer can print a book without ever experiencing the story encoded within or appreciating its mental origin, so too could a biological machine be built from the ground up without ever encountering the magic that might be at work within. In the end, it would be little different to parents having children as they always have done. They may facilitate the existence of a new conscious being, and yet there is no understanding of how. And yet, paradoxically, despite its notorious intangibility, consciousness is the only thing that we actually truly know. Hence, to summarize the inspiration for our model, it is born out of the inadequacy of a materialist philosophy to ever satisfactorily explain consciousness. Its principal, foundational root draws life from the unfathomable intellectual leap into the dark that we must undertake when palming consciousness off to material processes. In short, if consciousness is all that we know and can ever know, and its emergence from the physical is unnecessary and nigh on inconceivable, then why not incorporate it as the foundation of the model, the fundamental component from which the material emerges? Yes, matter and energy are real, and yes, time and space are real, but at their most fundamental level, they are experiences of thought. Moving on to our second criterion, does our model satisfy Occam's razor? This requirement is practically built into the type of idealistic model that we are proposing here, as there is really only one cog to speak of, and that is consciousness itself and its alter ego, information. Any subordinate processes that emerge from consciousness can of course be facilitated in numerous ways and via numerous submodels. But we are principally concerned here with the most fundamental layer, the underlying substance from which all is made. In this sense, materialism and its most successful theories can be maintained as submodels that exist within the container of consciousness, hence retaining their unquestionable usefulness whilst relieving them of the burden of explaining consciousness. We really just have an order reversal, removing consciousness from a dependent position and instead placing it underneath the physical layer at the core of existence. When various implications of our particular brand of idealism have been discussed, as was the case in the last chapter, various suggested outcomes are necessarily speculative, but they are nevertheless logically reasonable and not unnecessary complications. As best as a subjective author can tell, Occam's razor is not at all violated. Lastly, is our model intellectually honest? Are there problems with our model or difficult obstacles that it must overcome that we have thus far yet to elucidate? In proposing an alternative model, it is necessary to drive home its positive attributes. But let us take a moment now to consider those observations that might be at odds with our idealist framework of reality. One of the standout arguments against idealism might be the existence of unconscious states. If consciousness is fundamental, then why are there times when it doesn't exist, at least as far as an external observer can determine? Where are you when you are unconscious? This question is also an obstacle to the existence of an afterlife, as it seems fairly good evidence that the finality of death is real and nothingness lies beyond. Another argument is, of course, the clear correlation between brain damage and subsequent mental attributes. A third conundrum might be found in the proposed eternal nature of consciousness. If it is fundamental and thus without origin, then where are we before we are born? These are fair points and are indeed obstacles to an idealistic model such as that proposed here. But to borrow David Chalmers' nomenclature of hard and easy problems, these are arguably easy problems. Yes, they are problems, but solutions are not unfathomable. For instance, as we discussed in section 5.6, memory of periods of awareness can, it would seem, be removed by mere hypnotic suggestion. It is not impossible that we remain conscious in some form during periods under general anesthesia or unconsciousness. We may simply be denied the memory of that awareness upon waking. As we also discussed in section 5.6, the effects of brain damage on mental attributes does not mandate that the mind is emergent from the brain. If the brain is a manifested vessel of consciousness, and its mechanical link to material sensory organs and memory cells, then it is reasonable that the mind would no longer be communicated properly once the brain is damaged. With regards to the last point, if consciousness is fundamental, then does that definitely mean that every mind always exists? It is certainly possible and the favored position within this book, but it can be potentially explained in the same way as the first argument. The memory that we have access to within our usual waking conscious state is not necessarily the entirety of our memory. Furthermore, it should be stated that a brain or body needn't be a perfect representation of mind. The existence of memories from prior to birth need not be a predicted feature arising within our model, nor mental disablement indicative of a disabled soul. In addition to these points, some might also argue that consciousness may in time come to be fully explicable by materialistic models. This is perhaps a question of intuition more than anything. But the argument shall be made here that for the currently prevailing brand of materialism, favored by the majority of scientists, to have any hope of producing consciousness, it must be fundamentally altered. There is no consciousness particle within the standard model, and there is no conscious aspect to the building blocks of nature. And that would appear to be the only way that consciousness could ever be built in as part of the material world. Arguably, materialism would have to merge with panpsychism to have any capacity to resolve the hard problem of consciousness. One of the noteworthy aspects of models built around panpsychism is that they can maintain some separation between consciousness and information, whereas pure idealism of the kind espoused here equates information with consciousness, envisaging them as two sides of the same coin. This is not so much an advantage of panpsychism as simply a difference, and again comes down largely to personal intuition. As stated in section 5.12, our position here is that both consciousness and information ultimately appear to amount to the same thing and become the same thing. This would seem to imply that the material universe is somehow a consensus of consciousness, the library of diaries of thoughts that we spoke of at the end of the last chapter. Just as an author of fiction imagines their world and encodes it on paper, Somehow, it would seem that we are all collectively doing the same thing. All that is would seem to ultimately exist as a network of minds and their constituent thoughts. Hence, the mind, the soul, ultimately carries the weight of all that exists.